Bueno, pues estoy encantada de estar aquí con ustedes, especialmente de hablar sobre la Virgen de Guadalupe, una de las temas más favoritas mías. Y quiero empezar primeramente como Thomas nos explicó con una bendición. So, por favor, un momento. Querido Dios, te damos gracias este día en una manera muy especial por la Virgen de Guadalupe y por todos los dones y bendiciones y toda la belleza que ella nos da. Y te damos gracias también por la comida que tenemos hoy día y te lo pedimos para todos los que no tienen de comer ni lugar de vivir, para que podamos abrir nuestros corazones en una manera mucho más abierta. Por todo eso te damos la gracia y en el nombre de tu Hijo Jesucristo. Amén. Okay. I want to begin, first of all, by offering a word of gratitude, certainly to Tom Groom, who has invited me to do this, and I'm very grateful to him for the invitation. And also, of course, to Karen Kiefer and to Jessica O'Haran, who have been a great support to me in my work here at Boston College and certainly in putting today together. And as I begin today, I want to start with this particular image. This is the image of Santa Lucia. Some of you may know that Santa Lucia's feast day is on December the 13th. So today we celebrate Guadalupe, tomorrow the feast of Santa Lucia. I start with Santa Lucia because Santa Lucia is the patron saint of eyesight. And one of the traditions inside of the Latino community and certainly inside of the Mexican-American community, especially in the state of New Mexico where I was born, is a tradition of retablos, of images of saints that dot the walls of our homes and keep us focused on being invited into the communion of saints. And I use Santa Lucia. She appears in my office right above my desk at here at Boston College, because she's the patron saint of eyesight. And I think theologians are responsible for being very attentive to what we see. And Santa Lucia reminds me of that daily, that what am I looking at? What do I see? And so I'm going to offer today an interpretation, a new interpretation, I believe, of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And it really is focused on a particular seeing. And so I'd be interested in your response to this presentation. But I wanted to start with Santa Lucia because I think the whole question of seeing and sight is very important for theologians. Since my earliest memories, I've been fascinated by the story of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Apart from the Gospels, there's no other story that has fascinated me more than this story. And the image of Guadalupe appeared in every room in my grandmother's home. My mother has a huge wall with a shrine to Guadalupe, many different interpretations. In my home, I have an image of her literally in every room. So this has been part of my own upbringing. When I was 11 years old, my parents took me and my brothers and sisters to Mexico City and to see the original image hanging in the old basilica, which it's hard to even get into at this point, but in the old basilica. And it took several days to get there. We drove from El Paso, Texas to Mexico City, which is about 1,200 miles, and through the desert. And I was overcome as an 11-year-old watching all these pilgrims on their knees in enormous devotion to this image and wondering why is it that this image evoked such devotion. There are many, many images of Mary, as we know. Certainly La Virgen de Fátima in Portugal, right? La Virgen de Lourdes in France, and La Virgen de la Alta Gracia in la República Dominicana, La Virgen de la Caridad del Cobre in Cuba, y La Virgen de la Divina Providencia in Puerto Rico. and a multitude of others. So every country in Latin America has a Virgen, that there is a devotion that's very significant. But what I want to suggest to you today, that Guadalupe, in many ways, is exceptional, even among these vírgenes, which may be a little sketchy to say with some of my Latino colleagues who are here. So wait a second. But I believe that she may rightly be called an American Pentecost, and that she has a very significant contribution to make. And so why do I believe that? That Guadalupe is worth being called an American Pentecost. But before I get into to explaining that, what I would like to do is to have each of us take a moment and to talk to the person next to us about these questions. ¿Con qué imagen de María se identifica? What image of Mary do you identify with? And how did you, the second question, how did you come to identify with this particular image? So just to get us in touch with our own connections to Mary. So we'll just take a couple minutes for you to do that, just with the person next to you, and then I'll continue my presentation. You've had a chance to connect in with what is important for you. I hope you've had a chance to share a bit of that. I was just hearing from this group too, there are, I know with my Latin American brothers and sisters, that there are many different images, and in fact, each country often is very intensely devoted to their particular image of Mary. So of course I'm biased, I'm Mexican American, so I want to convince you of the importance of Guadalupe and the exceptionality, I believe, of her story. But there are many other devotions that are very, very important. Nuestra Señora de Luján, Argentina, and many others. So the list is quite long in Latin America. Okay, my thesis for the work I'm going to present to you today is that Guadalupe is worthy of the title an American Pentecost because this symbol mediates an experience of the Holy Spirit for us. And this is a bit of an unusual claim. Why? Because there's all kinds of work that's been done between Guadalupe and the Bible, but that work is largely connecting Guadalupe to Revelations 12. And you'll often see in the masses that we celebrate in her honor, that the passage from Revelations 12 is often the passage that is read and connected to Guadalupe. And I'm coming in with a very different reading of her, and I hope that you will find this compelling. We'll see. So this is my thesis, that Guadalupe es digno del título un Pentecostés americano porque este símbolo media para nosotros una experiencia del Espíritu Santo. She mediates an experience of the Holy Spirit. Okay, so I'm going to divide my remarks today in 3 parts. So how is it that I'm getting to this point? And first of all, I'm going to explain briefly what I mean by Guadalupe, which may seem self-evident, but isn't necessarily. What I mean when I use the term American, and then also Pentecost. What do we intend by Pentecost? So I'll begin by first identifying Guadalupe as an American Pentecost. And you'll see here that I don't intend to merely focus on the image alone. I think its historical context is very important. And it precedes the apparition, and so understanding that historical context makes the image of Guadalupe all the more powerful in my judgment. And I will also say a bit about the story of this apparition, and then finally the religious symbolism that's depicted in this image. So when I talk about Guadalupe, I intend all 3 of these. The image itself, its historical context, the story of the apparition, and the symbolism that's present in the image. And second, by American, so that's what I mean by Guadalupe. By American, I not only intend the states that make up the United States. We often in this country, especially in our political climate, use American to refer to people from the United States, assuming that that's what we're talking about, when in fact, people from Canada all the way down to the tip of the Tierra del Fuego, and everyone in between, are all Americans, the Americas, you know, the larger context of the Americas. So thus, by American, I'm referring to the whole of the American hemisphere, certainly not just the United States. And then finally, Pentecost. I mean not only the inaugural Pentecost event that's recorded in Acts chapter 2, but Pentecost as a progressive reality, as an ongoing account of the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. Spiritual scholars like Robert Tannehill, who's done a lot of work on Luke and the book of Acts, and he tells us that the outpouring of the Holy Spirit recorded in Acts 2 is the beginning of a trajectory that goes throughout human history. And so I believe that Guadalupe is one such instance of this. So to defend this claim, I'm going to begin with these particular 3 points. I was just clarifying a couple of ideas there. But these 3 points, first of all, the first refers to an examination of Guadalupe as, in terms of its historical context, the account of the apparition and the religious symbolism, which I just introduced, but I'm going to go through it in a bit more detail. And then second, I will draw forward a few of the important dimensions of Pentecost. What distinguishes Pentecost as an event? And identifying the outpouring, the elements that distinguish the outpouring of the Holy Spirit in Pentecost. So we're going to name that in order to then think about, now, does Guadalupe also warrant this kind of a connection, which is my third and final section. So I'm going to begin by looking at el contexto histórico y el relato de Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe. So looking at the historical context and the account of Guadalupe. So the significance of Guadalupe cannot be understood apart from the context in which she appeared. We begin with the year 1519. So 1519 is a brief 27 years after 1492, which of course we all know what happened in 1492, right? Cristobal Colon, who's also known as Christopher Columbus, but first off as Cristobal Colon, fatefully landed on the shores of what we now know as the Bahamas. In 1519, Hernán Cortés lands on the Mexican shores close to what is present-day Veracruz. He had some men, but not an overwhelming number. And, but in addition to the men he also had gunpowder and horses, neither of which were part of the Americas. And so some of the Aztecs thought Cortés was their god Quetzalcoatl. So you see Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl was also known as El Serpiente Emplumado, the emplumed serpent, right? So it's very much, this figure is a deity of the Aztecs, very much an incarnational kind of figure in the sense that from the heavens, emplumado, meaning a bird, you know, who flies in the heavens, pero serpiente, a serpent, a snake that is on the ground. And so it becomes very much an incarnational figure. And as I said, the Aztecs in the New World, I didn't mention this, but they'd never seen a man who had hair on his body, like a beard or hair on his chest, which Cortés did. And so when they see Cortés, they're baffled because he looks not like men that they're aware of, and they believe that Cortés perhaps could be Quetzalcoatl. So there's a lot of deference that's shown to Cortés. And between 1519 and 1521, Cortés and his men fought their way from Veracruz all the way to Tenochtitlan, which is today, present-day Mexico City. So Veracruz, you can see, is about right here, and then Mexico City is this red block here in the middle. And so they fight all the way to Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Nahua community, and this is a depiction, an artistic depiction of what it looked like. And in the process, Cortés convinced a lot of the other indigenous tribes, not Aztec tribes, but other tribes, to fight with the Spaniards against the Aztecs. So he was trying to pit the indigenous community against the Aztecs, other indigenous communities. And in the end, it ended in a nightmarish, bloody, brutal battle El Noche Triste, in August of 1521, when Cortés defeats Cuauhtémoc, who was basically the emperor of the Aztecs. And the streets of Tenochtitlan, as the historians tell us, were covered in rivers of blood. So this early 16th century brutal conquest of Mexico by the Spanish meant a tragedy and a violence and loss of epic proportions. And while they experienced a brutal defeat, the Aztecs, the more significant defeat they knew was a spiritual vanquishment. And this was much more brutal and more devastating for them. The collective effect of their military, political, cultural, and religious defeat was to turn the desire among the Aztecs into a kind of death wish. Because the belief was the world works in cycles. We have come to the end of this cycle. That's what the appearance of Quetzalcoatl means. And so it's time for our people to perish from the earth, and we will no longer live on this earth. And so there's a despair and a belief that this is the end of our people as a people. So there's a loss of all energy for life. Not only did many commit suicide, there are accounts of some mothers who shortly after giving birth began killing their newborns because they did not want their children to be enslaved to the Spanish conquistadores. And the Aztec, we have to appreciate that the Aztec cosmovision of the time certainly contributed to the idea of a communal death and then a rebirth, and then ideally a rebirth that would happen. But they didn't have a vision of a rebirth at this point. Their communities had been through several cycles like this, so this was the cycle at this point in history. The conquest ushered in an enormous rupture of life and an accompanying oppression on all levels. The Spanish institutionalized their oppression of the indigenous along 4 lines: through political and economic dominance that favored the Spanish and exploited the indigenous, through sexual violation of the native women enacted by the Spanish conquistadores and then adopted by later by other indigenous men as well, through a social psychological control in which the most accomplished and wise among the indigenous were permanently reduced to servitude, and finally through a religious domination which labeled all facets of the indigenous faith inherently evil and indigenous converts to Christianity incapable of contributing to the development of Christian theology. So within a few years, Spanish religious missionaries set about trying to convert the indigenous, and they set up these dialogues. And in fact, there was such energy in Spain for this that they sent 12 Franciscans to New Spain, right next to New Spain, and they were called Los Doce, the 12, you know, and the idea of, okay, here come the 12 apostles again. This is new virgin land. We're going to convert all these people and make them Christians. And this is a gift that God has given to the Spanish. There was a belief of that. The Aztec faith, the Aztecs saw the Christian faith as literally incomprehensible as these dialogues started to occur. It was literally incomprehensible because the Aztecs believed that to speak to the gods or of the gods in any truthful fashion necessarily meant speaking in poetry. So there's a phrase in Spanish that's often used, flor y canto, flower and song. If you were not speaking of the gods in poetry, whatever you were speaking about was not about the divine. So it's a very important point here, and one of the reasons why the wisdom figures of the Aztecs and the Spanish, the Los Doce, as they're having their conversations, it just doesn't work. And the Spanish thought that, religion had to be, the Catholic faith was very concerned with doctrinal purity. So they brought with them a very narrow and rigid conception of religious truth. And because for the Spanish, religious truth could only mean a strict adherence to the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church, they could not imagine a real, genuine dialogue with the Aztecs on the level of religion, an interreligious dialogue. That just simply was not conceivable. And for the Aztecs, as I said, reason alone could never be the way of thinking about God. So we're having two very, very different ways of thinking religiously. So given the inability of the Spanish to comprehend the Aztecs and the Spanish assumed superiority over the Aztecs, the missionaries explicitly set out to suppress religious beliefs of the native people as an initial and, in their minds, necessary step in the process of Christian evangelization. In short, the conquest and its aftermath so completely destroyed all facets of the Aztec way of life and system of belief that many of them longed only for death. There seemed to be no point to living anymore, and this was an outlook that characterized a large cross-section of the Aztec people. In the end, the Spanish missionaries' attempts to dialogue and evangelization generated a few conversions, but not that many. So there are two accounts. So that basically gives you a bit of a historical context. So I'm going to now talk a little bit about the apparition itself. So the apparition is said to have occurred in 1531. So the conquest comes to its conclusion in 1521. 10 years later, we have the apparition. And there are two accounts of the apparition, both of which are not ever published until 1648. So it's 20, 30 years later that you have the first recorded accounts of the apparition. The first by a Spanish priest by the name of Miguel Sanchez. He's a Mexican-born Oration priest, but he's of Spanish heritage, his parents are. And he publishes an account titled Imagen de la Virgen. He uses all kinds of, he's the one who makes the connection to Revelation 12. He has all kinds of discussion of the patristic scholars like Augustine. He was certainly deeply steeped in Augustine's work and many other of the patristic scholars. And he's trying to show how Guadalupe is connected up with is an outgrowth of a lot of what we learn from patristic scholarship. And really, Latino theologians are only beginning to explore this kind of work. Tim Matovina right now is writing a book to draw this out and make this connection, because this work, meaning the work of Sanchez with regard to the patristic figures in the early part of our church's history, that work has not been explored in our own time theologically in any sufficient way. Tim Matovina has done the most significant work on it, and he's at the moment writing a book on this. The second account is published just about 6 months later, also in 1648, published by Luis Lasso de la Vega, who's the vicar of the Hermitage of Guadalupe. His account is what we now know today as the Nicamaupoa. And if you read, if you've read the account of Guadalupe, chances are his account is the account that you've read, Lasso de la Vegas, not Miguel Sanchez. Lasso de la Vegas was originally written in Nahua. Miguel Sanchez's account was written in Spanish. Lasso de la Vega Nahua, which is the language of the Aztecs. And it's a popular text that he put out there that is widely known today. And what we gain from this is that in the midst of the utter destruction that the Aztecs know, what comes into the imagination through the writing of the Nicamaupoa and also Miguel Sanchez's work is the idea of a Mexican phoenix. So Guadalupe has been termed, there's another scholar in England who's done a lot of work on the political history of Guadalupe. His name is D.A. Brading, and he titles his book, his very celebrated book, The Mexican Phoenix. So Guadalupe is an image coming out of the ashes of this destruction. And so I'm going to share a little bit about the story. The story that I'm sharing is coming out of the Nicamaupoa, so Lasso de la Vega's work. So according to the apparition's story, Guadalupe is, Juan Diego, a 55-year-old indigenous man, is on his way from the outskirts of Mexico City to its center to attend Mass. And he's one of a very small number of converts. So he passes the hill of Tepeyac, And along the way, he hears singing. This is important, singing, canto, singing at the top of the hill. And the singing pleases him, and it puts him in a kind of trance because he can't believe what he's hearing. And he hears himself addressed by name. Dignified Juan, querido Juan Diego, lo más precioso de todos mis hijos, very dignified Juan, the most precious of all my children. And he looks up the hill and he sees Guadalupe, and she introduces herself as the mother of God of great truth, Teotl, which is a Nahua term, of the one through whom we all live, the creator of persons, the owner of what is near and together, of the Lord of heaven and earth. That's the title she uses to introduce herself. So she's pulling Christian ideas in this account as well as indigenous ideas. So there's a link going on here. So she tells him she wants a chapel built there where she appears to him on the hill of Tepeyac. And she tells him, and I quote, this is a translation from the Nicamapoa, I very much want and ardently desire that my hermitage be erected in this place. In it I will show and give to all people all my love, my compassion, my help, my protection, because I am your merciful mother, the mother of all the nations that live on this earth and who love me. There in the hermitage I will hear the laments and remedy and cure all the miseries of and misfortunes and sorrows of the indigenous. So she promises her presence. That's an important point as we move to Pentecost. She promises her presence. She entrusts Juan Diego to take this message to the bishop, Bishop Zumarraga in Mexico City. Now, as many of us know, the bishop does not believe Juan Diego when he presents this message, and he's very embarrassed about this. Guadalupe requests, he tells the bishop, Guadalupe wants you to build a chapel on Tepeyac Hill. And the bishop, we might imagine, wonders why the mother of God would ever appear to an indigenous man. That just doesn't make any sense. And so the bishop thinks if she was going to appear to anyone, she would appear to the bishop himself or to one of his priests. So the bishop tells Juan Diego that he cannot proceed to build a chapel on the basis of Juan Diego's word and message alone, that the bishop tells him to bring a sign from Guadalupe. So the story has various chapters to it, but eventually there's another miracle of Guadalupe healing Juan Diego's uncle, who's very ill at the time as well. So I'm not going to tell that part of the story, but it's longer than what I'm giving you. But so Guadalupe, when he goes back, he tells Guadalupe how sad and embarrassed he is that he wasn't successful. And in fact, he tells her, I'm just a pile of old sticks. I'm literally human excrement, and the bishop is not going to believe me. Come on, And so he says, you should send somebody like a priest or somebody who the bishop will take seriously. So Guadalupe says, no, I want you to go. And so she tells Juan Diego to go to the top of the hill and to cut down roses that he would find there, roses in the middle of December. So remember we talked about floricanto, song, roses, floricanto. So he cuts roses down from the Tepeyac Hill in the middle of December. He brings the roses to Guadalupe. She rearranges those roses in Juan Diego's tilma, the apron he wears. And the roses are the sign that she tells Juan Diego to give to the bishop. So these roses are themselves a miracle. They're not roses that were indigenous to the Americas. And so Juan Diego thinks, like he's mesmerized by all of this. And he didn't also realize that Guadalupe was going to offer a second sign. So after much effort, Juan Diego goes in to see the bishop a second time, Bishop Zumarraga. And Juan Diego opens his tilma in the presence of the bishop, and the roses there, very fragrant, all fall to the floor. Right? And the story goes that the bishop kneels down because he also sees the image of Guadalupe on the tilma of Juan Diego, which is what we have today in Mexico City, the original. So immediately the bishop is stunned by the fragrant roses, and then he's also stunned by this image that he sees on Juan Diego's tilma. he sinks to his knees and he recognizes the presence of the sacred and divine mystery in the beauty of the roses and the beauty of the image. So turning to the religious symbolism, in the years that follow, this image makes its way throughout the Valley of Mexico, and it stirs the imagination of the indigenous, and there is a very slow conversion that comes about through the image. There are some accounts, like Virgil Elizondo claims that it happens really fast, and that there's all kinds of conversions. People see this image. Tim Matovina, who's done a lot more careful work on this, historically on what happened, and he's written and published about how the conversions start to come, but that it's a slower process, that it takes a number of years. But no doubt the image had a huge impact. There's a transformation from a death wish to a hope for life. Why is that? Because her skin color is morena. It's a mixture of Spanish and indigenous blood. She has a glyph above her womb, on her gown above her womb, that suggests that she carries the center of the universe. The Aztecs, their primary gods were the sun and the moon, and so she doesn't obliterate those, but they're also integrated into this new reality, and the stars. If you study the Aztec mythology, and that's a whole fascinating story, which we don't really have time for today, but to understand the role of the god of the sun and the moon and the stars in their own cosmology is quite rich. And so she's not obliterating these. The stars on her veil are here. And so this is a symbol, apart from what one believes about the apparition itself. It's a miracle, I believe, because of the integration of these two symbol systems that are so profound both for Christians and also the indigenous. Because she also, you know, the glyph above her womb, Christians would interpret this as being a symbol of Jesus Christ, her pregnancy with Jesus Christ, and that she herself doesn't carry herself as a god. Her eyes are cast down, which means that she herself is not divine, but that she is, she's sacred, but not a divine figure, because the gods would always look at you directly in the eye, right? But so there's lots of symbolism here. And she's seen by the indigenous as a gift that God is promising a new tomorrow, especially in her skin color, because the idea is that there will be many more mestizos to come. Most people in Mexico are mestizos. There are people who are still, there's large indigenous populations that are poor blood indigenous, but those numbers are not as large as the mestizo population in the country. So her skin color is a symbol. The fact that the whole cosmos here, in the moon and the sun and the stars, are all present here. And this also represents the cycle of the coming cycle of a new chapter of life. So the hieroglyph above her womb indicates it's not the absolute end of a people, but the beginning of a new people. Okay, so we have a death resurrection theme going on. Okay, so we have a little background on Guadalupe, and I promise I'll be done here in the next 15, 20 minutes. But I think I'm imagining that you all don't necessarily know that the larger history of the context in which the apparition took place. And maybe the other thing to mention too about her, you know, second only to the Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, this is the most visited Catholic site in the world. And it's extraordinary, it's just extraordinary. I just got back from Amarillo, Texas last weekend. The Bishop of Amarillo had a big celebration to Guadalupe in the Civic Center in Amarillo. And they had a couple thousand people here. The Vietnamese community was there dancing. The Igbo people from Nigeria were dancing. So my point is, the symbol, especially in different dioceses, the parts of the Church of the West, is celebrated in terms of speaking to many, many different groups. And it's a great symbol of the Catholicity of the Church. And you see that today. The matachinas, there were many matachinas dancers. The indigenous dancers have an ongoing procession of dance to Guadalupe. And in Amarillo last weekend, there were 6 different troops of indigenous dancers as well that were part of this. So it's a big event. So the dimensions related to Pentecost. My comments in this section are really built on the work of Robert Tannehill, who I mentioned before. We know that before Pentecost, sometime after Jesus' resurrection, that for that period of time after his resurrection and before Pentecost, that the disciples of Jesus were filled with fear. We hear that often. The Romans had brutally crucified Jesus, and the disciples who had had all of their hopes in dreams placed in a better tomorrow in Jesus seemed to have them now dashed as their leader has been crucified. And though he is resurrected, that in and of itself doesn't yet stir enough of a courage and a zeal in response to the fear that they feel. So at Pentecost, what we find out, what we learn, is that fear is transformed into courage, into power, into a zeal for mission, into an unmistakable awareness of God's abiding grace. So we know that as we read this. And then what Tannehill tells us is that there are 4 distinguishing characteristics of Pentecost: promise and presence, the power for mission, a zeal for mission, really, the change, the transformation of a sense of death and fear into life. So a death resurrection, really. And then the gift of the Holy Spirit, he claims, is a progressive reality. So just to talk about that for a moment. Before the first Pentecost, we learn that the Spirit has been promised by Jesus many times throughout the Gospels, that the Spirit is going to be poured out on all flesh. We hear that echoed throughout the Gospels. And John the Baptist, we just heard about John the Baptist this past Sunday, he announces the promise of the Spirit as well. And Jesus shares this promise with his disciples, and he tells them that this promise of the gift of the Spirit is imminent. So that's one, the whole notion of promise and presence is really significant. And then the power for mission. What happens when the gift of God's Spirit is given? The gift of the Spirit generates a zeal for mission. And time and time again, we see this in the book of Acts, a zeal for mission. And a mission that is universal in scope, that includes everyone. So you see the Spanish and the indigenous come into a greater understanding of themselves and what it means to be Catholic. And they both have that experience. So the mission is initiated by the Spirit is one that crosses racial, class, ethnic, and religious lines. It is a mission directed at every nation under heaven. So certainly echoes of the Gospels, and certainly that's part of what happens at Pentecost. Third, the death to life characteristic. Chapter 2 of Pentecost, there's a fear that the disciples experience, and we know that that fear deadens the soul. But the gift of the Spirit melts that fear and draws out a zeal for the future. So the Spirit releases the power for mission, a mission that also releases the ties and binding of sin that's experienced. And what Tannehill writes is that God's transcendence is displayed in the world when a surprising grace or a surprising justice appears that transcends and may contradict human intentions and powers. The Pentecost speech of Peter is certainly an example of that. And then the Spirit, Tannehill also claims, is a progressive reality, that the divine Spirit is that we discover at Pentecost is not a one-time event. The first Pentecost is not the full realization of this gift. This amazing, powerful transformation effected by the Spirit does not occur once and for all. It is a process and an ever-expanding reality. So what we have in the book of Acts are multiple experiences of Pentecost with the intention that they're going to continue long beyond what is recorded in Pentecost. And so I'm reading all of this thinking, okay, well, is Guadalupe an example of this? And I believe that she is. So we're going to look really briefly at some of these connections. Promise and presence. I didn't even change this. Oh, I thought I had, but I didn't. Okay. But so you see it here in English, right? Promesa y presencia. the zeal for mission, from death to life, and the gift of the Spirit as a progressive reality. So the promise and presence, Guadalupe can be identified as an American Pentecost because her story is one of her being present to us. She tells Juan Diego, am I not here who am your mother? And I will be here to hear your concerns, your stories. And it's, the people live that to this day. I remember some years ago going to visit the Basilica in Mexico City, and this woman at the top of the hill of Tepeyac, where there's a chapel, the original chapel that was built, this woman is sitting down praying before the image, and I'm kneeling down, and I kneel down next to her, and I couldn't help but overhear her prayer. And in an audible voice, she's praying for each, like every member of her family. She names them one by one. Then she starts praying for her cows and the chickens. And she goes through all these different parts of her life, and she's praying to say, would you help me to help me with my life? So the sense of Guadalupe being present to the very mundane realities of life, utterly, utterly clear there. And in the Basilica too, you see all kinds of images where you have these milagritos, which are little metal medallions that symbolize miracles. And so there's accounts of all kinds of miracles that are attributed to the intercession of Guadalupe. So my point is simply that the promise and presence of Guadalupe, she was understood that way and continues to be understood that way. In the Nicamapoa, she tells Juan Diego, listen and hear well in your heart, my most abandoned son, that what scares you and troubles you is nothing. Do not let your countenance and heart be troubled. Do not fear sickness or anxiety. Am I not here, your mother? Are you not under my shadow and my protection? Am I not your source of life? Are you not in the hollow of my mantle where I cross my arms? Who else do you need? So and this, you see this in Mexico City if you visit the Basilica. These words are like, they're up there posted in the Basilica. It's very, very, very significant. So the power for mission. As I've already noted, her image was shared with the indigenous people, and it did evoke, over time, conversions. Why? Through this image, the indigenous people began to see a future for themselves and their children. She offered an image they could identify with in all the symbolisms that I mentioned. And even more profoundly, through Juan Diego and the Christian Catholic Church, both Juan Diego and the Catholic Church came to know what it means to be about a universal mission. And so you see the power for mission for all, because Juan Diego helped Bishop Zumarraga come to a deeper understanding of the universality of the mission of the church. And Guadalupe offered a recognition that was groundbreaking for Zumarraga and also Juan Diego, who did not think himself worthy, right? But she called him into his own dignity in a very profound way. So she did not obliterate the indigenous drive for life, she affirmed it. And so there's an energy that's released to this. There's a resurrection experience. So I want to cover these last 2 points with just a story that I want to share with you to illustrate these two. It's a personal story. In my early 20s, right after I graduated from college when I was 21, I took the following 12 months to live in a small, dusty border town of Palomas, Chihuahua, Mexico. And quite frankly, without that year of experience, I wouldn't be a theologian today, quite literally, I'm sure that's true. So on the night of December 11th, I was up at the church, and it was close to midnight. And so there's Guadalupe in Mexico is even larger than Christmas. I mean, there's all kinds of people. We're going to have Mass at midnight, just like you have midnight Mass for Christmas. We have midnight Mass for Guadalupe. And everybody in town this is a small town of 5,000 people on the Mexican border, on the Mexican side. Everybody's crowded in this little church. And I was there, up in the balcony, part of the choir, and all these offerings of flor y canto to Guadalupe. So you have mariachi bands coming through, they sing a song or two. Somebody comes in, recites a poetry. You have people offering stories to Guadalupe, flowers to Guadalupe. So you have this whole procession of floricanto leading up to midnight mass. So before we get to midnight mass, there is a song that's sung, Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe, one of the many songs to Guadalupe. And as I'm singing in the choir in the balcony above, and I can see all this going on below me, I had a bird's eye view of all of it. They're singing Mi Virgen Ranchera, which is one of the common songs. And in the middle of this song, there's the large crowd there. They pull all the benches out of the church because they won't fit with all the people. So there's a huge crowd of people there, and that crowd starts to part. And there's a group of women whose arms are overloaded with dozens and dozens and dozens of luscious red roses. Now, Palomas, Chihuahua is out in the middle of the desert, in the middle of nowhere. There are no roses growing in Palomas, okay? But these women come in with these luscious red roses, and they make so the crowd parts, so these women can come up and offer their roses to Guadalupe. And nobody had offered like red roses before these women. Most people are offering plastic roses or, you know, other kinds of roses. Because this, not only are they not available in Palomas, but to buy roses like this would cost a fortune. And Palomas is very poor. So these women, you know, what's clear is as they come into the church, there are nods and sympathetic glances from several community members acknowledging these women. And but there's also body language that suggests others present in the church are not too comfortable with the presence of these women. And I knew at the time I'd been living in this town 11 months, and it's only a town of 5,000 people. So I knew most everybody in town, at least by sight. And I didn't recognize these women, and I was puzzled trying to figure out who are they and where did they get these roses. And most of us, and most importantly, why are they coming to honor Guadalupe? So I turned to my companion in the choir, and she says, son las cantineras, you know, they are the barmaids, which means they're the prostitutes in town. And in Mexico, prostitution is illegal. But one way that it continues to occur is that you have women who are practicing prostitution who rent out a room in the bars, in the cantinas, and the police turn a blind eye as long as these women are never walking around in the streets. So you never see them unless you walk into a cantina. And so, but these women make arrangements that are very, very difficult to make with the police, that one night a year they get to walk out of the cantina. And this is the night of Guadalupe. So these women come and they present their flowers to Guadalupe. And most of their clients in the rooms that they have in the cantina are mostly from the U.S., men that cross the border for their services. And these women, I was just struck by why they would find it so utterly central and critical to offer these roses to Guadalupe. As I talked to the town people, you know, of course, that the cantineras are working, they're doing this kind of work because they need money for surgery for a family member or to help make ends meet. But what an outrage that some of the townspeople there remarked that, you know, that there is no other way for these cantineras to make a living but by this particular choice. So their presence on the Feast of Guadalupe, I think, serves as an annual reminder of the egregious injustices wreaked on poor people, especially poor women. And the cantineras, in many ways, were affirming their own dignity, just like Juan Diego. You know, because Juan Diego did not want to go to see the bishop a second time. Guadalupe said, you have to go a second time. I can choose anybody, I want you. And these cantineras are basically in the tradition of Juan Diego. They're modern day Juan Diegos who affirm their own dignity in their offering and recognition of Guadalupe. Their roses, in many ways, through their roses, they participated in the feast and in the tradition of floricanto. And similar devotees have done this in terms of offering flowers. Similar cantineras have done this for years and years and years. So like modern Juan Diegos, they went through a great deal of trouble and personal sacrifice in order to present these roses. And in the process of their offering, many of us present were taken aback, perhaps a bit like the bishop. And yet, also like those present at the first offering of Flor y Canto, many of us found ourselves transfixed and transformed by the beauty of the roses and the image and the dignity of these women. Admittedly, you know, it's complicated. Like I was thinking, where do you see something comparable in the United States in our practice of Catholicity? I don't know. But you know, it made me aware that these women were inviting us to expand our imagination of the church and who is the church and what does being church mean. And I think they're asking for a transformation. So you see in them very much a transformation from death to life. They know a resurrection in their offering of these roses. And also they know they're signaling a hope. There's an eschatological dimension going on, a hope for a tomorrow that's going to be very, very different from the injustice in which they live today. Guadalupe, I believe, is an American Pentecost because she offers the promise of presence. She stirs us all to a mission. She invites us to see mission in a manner much beyond our initial conception. She transforms death into life. She is one expression of the gift of the Holy Spirit, an example of this gift of a progressive reality. She encourages in us a will to live and to believe that life is worth living even in the face of evidence to the contrary. So she encourages us to hope and that the power of the Spirit lives in our midst today and that Pentecost is with us now. So I'm going to end there. Thank you very much for your attention.